Kingdom Hearts is a long-running series that, while not the best, is the most important video game franchise to me of all time. With the release of my personal most anticipated game drawing closer and closer, I felt the need for introspection. The series has stuck true and strong throughout practically my entire life and had a significant influence growing up. I still fondly remember it was 2005 where I first laid my hands on this game, after Dad rented me a copy of the game from Video Easy in Australia, and I've never looked back ever since. This was unequivocally my first major fictional experience I was properly ever invested in. In all honesty, I probably wouldn't have this channel or be doing what I'm doing now if it weren't for Kingdom Hearts, as cheesy as that sounds. The gameplay can be absolutely stellar and cathartic, the soundtrack is captivatingly breathtaking without fail, and the story at its best has touched the hearts of many countless of times. Though there are a whole sea of glaring problems I can list all day as the series' lifespan drags on, I love it dearly despite its flaws. But today, we'll be looking back together in retrospect of the beginning, the base, the first of the beloved Kingdom Hearts action RPG, Square and Disney crossover series, as well as its very unlikely occurrence, and celebrating such a miraculous occasion as a longtime fan. Hello and welcome to a new video. I'm Vanguard, and today, I'll be presenting my retrospective critique of Kingdom Hearts. But without further ado, let's get right into it. In the 1990s, a man by the name of Tetsuya Nomura, a person that carried out programming and manga artistry as hobbies growing up, was hired by Squaresoft. He was brought into the business as a designer during times where Square was gaining momentum towards the peak of their history, along with the golden age of JRPGs, so it was difficult to find his place in the company. Initially, Nomura wasn't taken seriously. He began with a small and minimal role in the organization as a debugger, then later an art designer for multiple early Final Fantasy games as well as other titles in the company. He quickly made a name for himself among his colleagues, impressing even the legendary creator of the Final Fantasy series, Hironobu Sakaguchi, as well as director-producer Yoshinori Kitase, specifically on his hand-drawn monster illustrations as well as his written planning. He soon became a graphic director for FF6, a principal character designer for FF7, and served similar roles for 8 and 10. Additionally, he was also involved in many projects of Square's others and mentioned titles, in relation to creating character backgrounds, gameplay features, and storyline. Over time, we can see a strong and stylistic look that he evolves and develops into the rest of his career consistently. And it's clear that he learned other crucial skills of leadership, character creation, programming, and experience in the video game industry, especially when we look at his acclamation to what was in store for him next. In February 2000, he began working as a director for the very first time, a massive leap of faith for Nomura on a title we know as Kingdom Hearts. The idea blossomed between conversations with Shinji Hashimoto, Square producer, and Sakaguchi, after being heavily inspired by Super Mario 64 during times of financial failures, the second year in a row for Squaresoft in fact. They wanted to take a risk and create an ambitious experience that rivaled that of the all-time classic. Nomura, who happened to be in the same room at the time, volunteered that he would be the one to lead this project, and it was agreed right then and there. Hashimoto-san and Sakaguchi-san were talking about a discussion they'd had with Disney, having an exchange along the lines of, "Mickey Mouse would have been great, but we can't use him." At that moment, I basically put my hand up and said, I want to be a part of this. That's how it all began, but at that point, I wasn't really thinking of making a game that featured Mickey Mouse. The opportunity came for Hashimoto to pitch this project, who happened bumped into a Disney executive on the same elevator, since both the two companies once shared the same building, conveniently enough. And just like that, the unlikely concept of fusing the setting and themes of Disney films and Square Enix's theatrical storytelling together came into fruition, consisting of over 100 members from both sides involved in the development. However, Nomura had greater plans than just that. He often visualizes in the planning stage of all of the minute and major thematic details, and going into this game was no exception, where Nomura already possessed a firm sense of where exactly he wanted it all to go with great avidity. Naturally, there were conflicting conceptions that Disney and Nomura originally shared. They appeared to believe that we would make whatever they wanted us to make. They were really excited, explaining their ideas. To be honest though, I wasn't really interested in any of them, said Tetsuya Nomura. He even interrupted them halfway through a presentation to outright refuse their suggestions, to everyone's confoundment and utter awe. Since I did not understand what they were saying in English, I decided not to care too much about that, and told them about my primitive idea for Kingdom Hearts, all new characters going on a journey through the worlds inhabited by Disney characters. It was a rough and asperous journey, but I think Nomura's bravery and sheer drive to fight for his ambitious ideas against Disney of all companies worked out for the best in creating an unmistakable identity for Kingdom Hearts to stand on its own 2 feet, even to this day. This was partially because of Sakaguchi's influence on the project, advising him to create a story that rivaled that of the Final Fantasy series. I got a talk from Mr. Sakaguchi saying if we didn't aim for the level that Final Fantasy does, this project would be a failure. Well, I understood what he was saying. The gameplay was always the same sort of thing from the start, but we improved the story greatly. And apparently Ansem didn't even exist before that momentous conversation. It seems that this was a cardinal stepping stone to what gave life to this franchise's own image as we know of today. His early designs for Sora, the main character, was met with wide eyes and blunt criticism. Rightfully so in my opinion. Sora's primary weapon was once a chainsaw, believe it or not. However, refinements were made to harmonize the satisfaction of both companies, and Nomura's perspicuous vision was brought to life, in a product that unexpectedly blew many of us away. It eventually officially released on March 28, 2002 in Japan and in other countries later in the year. In the end, Kingdom Hearts received critical acclaim, selling approximately 5 million copies altogether, and inspired an entire long-running series that continues even to this day with over 10 different games. Kingdom Hearts 1 was also released multiple times as a Finamix exclusive in Japan, on the PS3 1.5 collection, as well as the PS4 1.5 plus 2.5. Kingdom Hearts is a 2002 action RPG developed by Square in collaboration with Disney Interactive for the PlayStation 2, creating a combination of many new themes we've never seen come together before. It tells a classic good versus evil in a hero's journey format. A charming, cheesy, bizarre, yet at times delivers a powerful emotional story about a young boy named Sora who is simply searching for his friends after his home was wiped out. The result of it all evokes a strong, poignant feeling throughout its climax and resolution, even leaving a few in tears. I myself look back on this entry excessively fondly. The graphical quality is pleasing to the eyes with a timeless cartoonish look, though facial animations are sometimes off-putting. The soundtrack is brilliantly crafted, unified seamlessly with the narrative, and the combat is for the most part solid for its time, and admirably serviceable for today's standards, but holds quite a few setbacks such as camera controls and platforming. Overall, if you're looking to play this game, you're in for a flamboyant ride that ranks as one of the better titles in the series, filled with nostalgia from every childhood. The draw to me at that age was, of course, the vibrant cast of Disney characters brought to life in a video game. It was the coolest thing ever at the time, and fighting alongside beloved characters I had grown up with genuinely immersed me deep into the experience. But while the presence of Disney was what gave me the motivation and intrigue to play this game in the first place, it wasn't necessarily what made me stay after all these years. Kingdom Hearts begins with an ominous and intriguing setup to the story, where the eccentric and perplexing cinematic opening plays, leaving a boy named Sora falling deep underwater. A stained glass floor opens up and glows the colours of a Disney princess, Snow White. It's a wild yet beautifully animated 3D rendered sequence, especially for its time. And the awesome song by Utada Hikaru, Simple and Clean, is a fan favourite, despite how different of a genre it is in comparison to what many of us Western audience listen to, becoming an iconic soundtrack for the series for its idiosyncratic style, wondrous vocals and upbeat music. The tutorial segment takes place in what is essentially the dreamscape of Sora's heart, and has a constant level of mystery, forebodingness and to a certain extent of engagement, as you slay away mysterious creatures known as Heartlesses, make puzzling decisions and find your way through a dark setting of different stations, all while being guided by a voice. This was personally one of the most memorable parts of the series growing up, purely from the distinct atmosphere of the design and sound. It is cryptic with a build-up of curiosity, but I think just at the right level, as it does foreshadow quite a few events that will happen down the line in a variety of ways. The riddles presented constructs towards a message well, but can feel a little ambiguous simply for the purpose of ambiguity, but still remains grounded and mostly rational upon reflection. After Sora reaches the end, he is consumed by the dark forces of his shadow. Sora wakes up from his nightmare, returned to his home known as Destiny Island. Here we are introduced to his childhood friends, Kairi, a tomboy as well as a possible love interest for Sora, and Riku, the rival, desiring strength, power and freedom, whom all aspires to leave their home. Now begins an endearing tale that I'm sure hit home for an abundance of us growing up, especially in the period of time that many of us played this. From here, a mystifying figure appears, unveiling abstrusely that the worlds have been connected. One night the island is swallowed by a dark portal, and the three main characters are scattered across the universe, granting them their wishes but in ways they hadn't planned. But Sora, through the magical powers of the cosmos, was chosen to be a Keyblade warrior, with the power to eliminate heartless creatures, travel across and save many worlds, by solving conflicts from each respective film in the process. It is from this point onwards he is accompanied with Donald and Goofy to both look for his friends and seal the keyhole that connects the world, putting an end to the heartlesses that threaten life, culminating in the preservation and revival of many homes including their own. In regards to the main characters, I wouldn't say any strikes as interesting initially, besides possibly Kairi and her history. However, her backstory isn't explored much in the game. On the surface, her presence honestly feels a little insignificant and unimpactful, other than serving as the damsel in distress, and as a character for both her friends to compete for. From the eyes of today, building on her existence as a Princess of Heart, as well as the unseen past between her and Ansem Seeker of Darkness all those years ago in Radiant Garden, in this particular game would have worked perfectly well, the best out of all the games given the circumstances presented in Kingdom Hearts 1. But her sending to Destiny Island is only merely touched upon in a Birth by Sleep Ultimania that exists outside of the games, which is honestly wasted potential. And this one extension would have helped place greater preeminence in her depth, which I think is often overlooked, as I did eventually go to like her in the end, even if that particular moment I thought was driven mostly by my attachment to Sora. The game could have enhanced the already emotional moments that involved her quite easily, I feel, if she was given more to do after her recovery. However, from the little scenes we got with her at the beginning, not only enunciates her valuable relationship to her two friends, along with the catalyst of the contention, but it does characterize and tell a fair amount about her. Even if it's not as much or as emphasized as I would have preferred, her portrayal is all about the insecurity of her past, emotional dependence on Sora and Riku, the fear of change and anything that could break the trio apart. If they focused and accentuated these elements to greater degrees, I think more people wouldn't have neglected her character arc and role, with clearer and relatable struggles, distinct from all the other characters, as well as highlighting the very minute and subtle development she actually did achieve at the conclusion. I honestly never realized this until my third playthrough, of coming to terms with inevitable changes in life, letting go and accepting certain things, as well as making a decision of trust to a promise. The ending of Kingdom Hearts was indeed Kairi's moment. This theme I hold personal sentiment to growing up, and further exploration of these aspects would have made for a compelling, impactful message that more would have picked up on. Introducing her realization or recollection of her past, and her comprehension that things just won't always be the same, would have really gone a long way. The ingredients are there to craft a fine idea, I just wish it had more prominence, setup and flavor. Riku is your typical strong-willed, independent, competitive, and at times arrogant, outgoing young boy, rivals with our protagonist. He immediately makes himself out to be the natural leader of the group, almost like a guardian, a protector of the trio, who has a firm desire to see the worlds beyond Destiny Island. Riku even seems like main character material. This was all expressed cleverly through the competitions you had with him at the beginning and through dialogue options made by NPCs about Riku. Ultimately, he yearns for freedom and the power from the world outside to always be there for those important to him. However, it is this blind eagerness and lust for power behind his noble intent that leads him to his downfall. His character is perfectly symbolic with one of the iconic quotes of the series: "The closer you get to the light, the greater your shadow becomes," which I think best describes Riku and his tunnel vision search for power. He's a flawed person and one of the more relatable members of the series. His enviousness and greedy, desirous nature begins later in the story after he's reunited with Sora, where his willingness to protect Sora diminishes, genuinely surprised that he could take care of himself, and falsely felt that his role as a friend had been replaced. Left with a new mindset of jealousy or even loss of identity. All of this happens as Maleficent pulls the strings of the credulous teenager in the background. The roots of his character arc I also wish was further fleshed out from his perspective on Destiny Island, as there's a lot of inferring to do if you want to further enjoy his character, and not be simply annoyed by his brash personality. I've seen many people state that he seems irritating and idiotically one-dimensional, painfully foolish in his gullible nature, and I can agree with that view to a certain extent because of how he was articulated, but I feel that there's more than just that. If they expanded on his initial intent, internal struggles and fall from grace, after being such a righteous leader-like individual, I think a lot of us could have felt a great deal of empathy for his situation. He loses his identity, his vision and his place in the trio as he delves unknowingly deeper into the abyss due to his lust for power and hurting of those he deems worthless. The aspect of his identity crisis is something I wish they conveyed more emotionally, by having a longer setup of who he originally was on Destiny Island to create more of a tragic dichotomy. Though he was initially suspicious of Maleficent, which I appreciate, he seems to struggle very little with making certain darker decisions. That being said, I didn't feel a great need for all of this to be explored, as in my opinion they at least showed him enough in action later on. He was one of the main antagonists after all, so it's only natural to see him as a distant outsider, which they did do well. We can all relate to his teenage angst that he showcased in some form. It just made it harder to commiserate his downward descent because of its obvious wrong nature. But overall, I found entertainment in Riku as an enemy, finding the path to redeem himself by sacrificing the freedom he yearned and arduously fought for so long, to fulfill what truly mattered to him at last, the right way. And finally we have Sora, a simple, inspiring, optimistic, happy-go-lucky normal boy, who would go through whatever trial it takes to be together with his friends again, acting with the instincts of his heart. He always holds a positive, relaxed and jubilant air, making him a fun, light-hearted and enjoyable protagonist to play. He's pretty much an everyman, where anyone playing will effectively be able to relate or project their own thoughts into his character. Responsibilities as well as great power is suddenly thrust onto him early in the narrative. However, unlike Riku, it does little to taint his vision, though he does at times struggles with the fact he feels lonely without his best friends, but he gives himself very little time to mourn over his loss, and grows through all the connections he makes eventually, which is another quality that opposes Riku, standing not necessarily on his own, but among those who are beside him, both new and old faces. The core differences between Sora and Riku in their cultivation from my reading is that Sora had Donald and Goofy with him, and a desire to see the world and meet people that supported and taught him to broaden his horizons outside of just his childhood friends, while Riku, though he technically had Maleficent, really had no one besides himself that had his best interests, and had no urge whatsoever to form new affinities. I think that was the major factor that separated their paths, making for an interesting discussion if the positions were reversed. Sora, upon analysis, isn't at all deep with intricate goals and unique struggles, at times even seems cliché, and the oddity of him feeling only moderately homesick and never thinking nor searching for his parents at that age is remarkably implausible. But he was forced to keep himself busy with the people standing beside him, and those flaws aren't really the highlight. He is a reactionary character, with simple aims, a strong belief, with an endearing persona that always is thinking about his friends, learning and accepting that sometimes that's all you can do, trusting that everything will work out in the end, understanding that the world is far bigger than both him and what his friends are, which is something Riku failed to grasp, truly helps the wide target audience appreciate the optimistic, light-hearted adventure. I believe Sora embodies the prevalent sense of adventure and companionship motif of the series perfectly well. These three central figures of the series, while weren't given much time at the beginning together, and the pacing with mundane activities didn't help with the presentation at all, regardless managed to create a well-realized cast with realistic, pure relationships that I could believe in and put plenty of care into over the years. They all dealt with connected themes of maturing towards adolescent in times that a lot of us were probably burdened with the same things, driving the character-focused plot. I think that's why a multitude of the fans of the series, including myself, hold special fidelity and affection towards Sora, Kairi and Riku outside of just nostalgic purposes. They're also the only group of original characters from the franchise that hints the idea of romance from my interpretation. The relationship, themes and arcs can go surprisingly deep upon inspection, with separate concepts encompassing the series' main prominent theme of companionship, and how it was all concluded accomplishes a graceful payoff for every single character, of Riku's redemption and compensation of his greed for power, Sora's imperishable will to venture through the unknown to reclaim a friend in need, and of course Kairi's acceptance, overcoming her impossible fantasy and expectation of an unchanging home and relationship, conclusively moving on, the quintessence of the scene. And it's by virtue of this growth, Kairi discovers what Sora had left for her in the introduction, symbolically representing their never-ending bond. This was the exemplification that she needed to learn from, where caring for the connection she still had triumphs in weight to the fixation of her fear in change and everything that she has lost. I think it's clear that I adore where they were going with their character, even if I have nitpicky problems in how little attention some characteristics were displayed in her and others, though to the game's credit, unlike other JRPGs, they weren't given many opportunities to elaborate, as they weren't party members, spending the majority of the time in Sora's shoes to find them. However, it's unfortunate she hasn't developed or had much plot significance since then, with the exception of possibly KH3. It is done well for what it is, begetting beautiful and unforgettable moments. At the same time, it can be enjoyed straightforwardly at a basic level, all without any convoluted lore getting in the way. The character arc setup is slightly weak, but the payoff is executed excellently. Ansem, Seeker of Darkness, on the other hand, is the manifestation of evil, or the leader of the Heartlesses, the main antagonist stringing all of the Disney villains along. He's a classic and iconic adversary of the series, portrayed as pretentious and condescending, holding a strong rapacity for power, which at first fuels him towards his goal, allowing compatibility between Riku and Ansem. But this is the exact trait that leads him to his perishment. Foreshadowing is done fairly and subtly, incorporated by the scene at the beginning, exposition and journals, with the journal creating false expectations of a noble man, explained in future installments, but the payoff of his reveal does come a little overdue considering the lateness in the game, almost shoehorned into the narrative, which is safe to assume given the development of his unplanned last-minute creation. But at the end of the day, it was effective. On one hand, he might seem flat or basic as a villain, whose motives isn't really fleshed out and is inferior in depth when compared to the main cast. On the flip side, for what it was a fearsome, edgy and remarkable antagonist as a kid, serving essentially as the tool and setup to the motive and end goal of the main enemy in the series, as well as future character arcs, all while being pretty entertaining. He was always a part of and a gateway to something greater, with his superior knowledge of the world that the main characters didn't have access to. Speaking of its lore, it can sometimes be quite odd, and can take a fair amount of time to grasp, depending on each player as it bounces between what we generally take as symbolism to quite literal functions. I've heard and talked to a handful of people in forums and in real life, who've said that this game is confusing, but I do disagree, though growing up with this franchise would have certainly sharpened my understanding naturally. However, I wouldn't ever say it is overwhelming or convoluted, as it is expressed at a digestible rate in the first game, by far the most coherent, rarely getting in the way of the high emotional beats of the story, the main focus. Conspicuously if you compare it to the other later installments down the line, producing quite the opposite effect where it distracts far more than explains what is going on. This game is more on the simplistic side, which is something I miss from Kingdom Hearts in general. There's still in-depth discussions to be had on certain details regardless. It is not supremely simplistic, so I think Kingdom Hearts struck the right balance in their wide demographic. But if shown in tropes such as the power of friendship, the battle of light and darkness, corny writing and at times awkward delivery you find of high nuisance when consumed, you might have a hard time enjoying the storyline, though it is executed solidly and charmingly in integral scenes. With Kingdom Hearts there is a twist in these ideas, as they're actually a part of the lore. If someone says so and so is in my heart for example, half the time it is literal, which can be jarring initially for some, however makes itself distinctive and even endearing to others when compared to similarly themed stories. The game does a fair job of exposition, world building and lore. It isn't cleverly incorporated into the narrative, but does a clear-cut job in letting the players understand whatever it's trying to say, such as aspects of Heartlesses, Keyblades, Keyholes, worlds, princesses and etc. Essentially everything you have to know about, albeit only at a basic level delivered with slow pacing. It does lack some depth in explanation, and I would have liked for more to have been explained to avoid confusion and a sense of randomness, like what and where did Kingdom Hearts go in the ending? How or why did Ansem meet his demise when the door to darkness opened? What is the purpose of the Dive to the Heart sequence? What are the origins of the Keyblade? And a few others would have been nice to see answered. Yet none of those questions felt like it mattered immensely in a character-driven story. It just comes in large numbers. Augmenting on the subject of the Dive to the Heart sequence, I don't believe it was ever clarified, at least clearly, the actual cause of this segment. How or why this was all thrust onto Sora, and the reason this was included in the game at all, as it does nothing to progress the story. I believe it was meant to give Sora the necessary knowledge and belief in himself, that he would be the one to save the universe with key in hand, seal the unknown door that plagued the worlds, and that Kingdom Hearts itself is somehow a force of benevolent light. But this point isn't strongly suggested, and is more inferred on my end. And his prime goal was almost solely looking for his friends. But how exactly he knew Kingdom Hearts was a force of light is likely from his experiences in all the different Disney worlds, so I don't have a prevalent problem in this plot point. Though further reminder of the Dive to the Heart event by Sora throughout, acting as his moral compass of the justice he brings, would have helped with these dilemmas, and pushed his sense of duty outside of his companions more authentically. However, its existence is still appreciated narratively, specifically for its illustrious atmosphere and hinting of what's to come. What they did do reasonably well in this area was the hinting of Ansem at the beginning and throughout the journal reports that you collect in the game, as I stated before, additionally for upcoming events in the storyline. While it would have made for more of a believable experience if the writers took the time to set up the majority of the rules, nomenclature, and foundations to the universe for a completer, solid story, like the Lord of the Rings universe for example, the need wasn't great given the point of the story, and that this was the setup of many to come. An unfortunate failing that emerges later on, however, is that the logic of the setting decreases the more time you spend with the world. An additional point is that the rule in this game was to not meddle in the businesses of other worlds, but for some reason that's all our main cast does anyways, and no real consequences arises in doing so, which makes me wonder why they even established that in the first place, in 3 major instances in fact. I assume the original characters had to act within the boundary of each world, but even that is kind of vague. These negatives might serve as some of the early cracks in the insane of a ride the series is. But while keeping it as simple as it was, and minimally explaining such elements did hurt in a few areas I mentioned, overall functioned pretty well. All of these negligible flaws barely mattered to the fanatical story, and especially to the protagonist, who just wanted to find his best friends, helping the halls of the lore becoming nothing of substantial significance. What I'm trying to say is that the lore, how the universe works, is probably the weakest part of the franchise in general, filled with retcon, inconsistencies, and vague details made up along the way, because of a weak foundation. Taking from the verisimilitude and validity of the setting the writers tried to build away, but Kingdom Hearts 1 did a clean job in this area, where I was actually invested in the setting of say Hollow Bastion, End of the World, the history, the lore, and Kingdom Hearts in general, filled with memorable designs, something I can't say is firmly for later installments, even though there's far more lore added. Where it fails, it either doesn't matter to the protagonist or to its audience. The quality of the lore in this game is far superior to the convoluted quantity found in the future. They handled it well in KH1, primarily highlighting their strengths, the characters, and the sense of adventure. The blend of Disney environment and iconic Final Fantasy individuals was surprisingly a seamless transition heading into this game, as bizarre of a concept as it first sounds, even intrinsic as a kid. This was due to the integration of another original story and the world building that allowed the players to accept this approach. And it was brought to life satisfactorily and magnificently to others, particularly for any kid who grew up with Disney. I think that was, for the majority of us, the early allure of this game. Just seeing such a rich diversity of character interactions you thought you'd never see brought so much interesting entertainment. It's considerably difficult to put into words than experiencing it for yourself. Soon after we are introduced to the world, there are references of Final Fantasy characters that Nomura designed, existing in multiple areas. I'm sure for a lot of the FF fans it was a delight to see these unforgettable casts again, however for me they somewhat felt odd and trivial, as someone who has never played any of the games at that age. Tidus, Waka and Selphie for instance were friends of Sora on Destiny Island, but was never mentioned past the beginning. And I've heard other complaints for Cloud for example, for how out of character, unfaithful and gloomy he is reimagined into Kingdom Hearts as, like a totally new person. It's abnormal to know that even Square themselves couldn't apprehend their own Final Fantasy characters, nor use their roles enthusiastically. Regardless of my own and others' feelings of their inclusion, they had their varying purposes such as giving important exposition of the world, serving as a story and secret boss battles, the development of certain themes, inspiring the original story, or simply fan service marketed towards long-time veterans of Square. Their involvement to me was never particularly meaningful and felt replaceable, but still partially needed due to the plot advancements and exposition specifically. On the other hand, the vibrant array of Disney films included in the game I thoroughly enjoyed. It brought an undying sense of adventure, with exploration around every corner, a treat for any fan of Disney, and by the end of the game you feel like you've just finished a huge extravagant story. How it was all consolidated into the Kingdom Hearts universe worked well, as they carefully stitched the films with the overarching story together. Never did the film stray far from its origins, but had enough novelty of Kingdom Hearts themes added, for the most part, to never feel out of place or extraneous to the underlying narrative. This was the only installment in fact that had the classic villains all interacting with one another against the protagonist, which made for one of the most iconic scenes ever. Taking down each one had a sensation of progression most of the time, except for a few, to what we thought was the main antagonist Maleficent, which fitted perfectly for a particular role out of all the other villains. While I do think the Disney villains should have worked a little more closely and cohesively together towards a common goal, though by natural characteristics I understand it would have been difficult, it was still nice to see them interact at all, even if it didn't amount to much. Each setting complemented and gave additions to the main theme that Kingdom Hearts dealt with, rather than just strictly rehashing the films for nostalgia functions solely. However, I will admit that the Disney films had a massive absence of creativity and charm that it originally embodied, though that one fact was always inevitable. Going through a few of the worlds felt languidly slow-paced, with to some extent a formulaic structure, and little additions of plot progression, lore, and themes. This is understandable as it demonstrates a young hero setting off in life, gaining the opportunity to come across countless of unrelated ordeals to his goals in periods of time, since the storyline and gameplay promoted the openness, but I would argue it lingers on this aspect for far too long. In contrast, it does merit positive features, in at least consistently advancing the protagonist's development, along with the construction of the relationship of his party members. It does have some great moments with the original cast and Disney setting, however doesn't really master either of the two, or the melding itself. The blend is sound, far better than any of us could have hoped to imagine, but does have some severely rough edges, giving excessive time to certain parts of worlds that overstay their welcome, progressing almost nothing to the story, or lack any originality when compared to the source material. Meanwhile, in vital and critical story moments that are intended to exude story emotions, is pace exorbitantly quick for my taste, such as Sora turning into a Heartless but returns immediately rather hastily, diminishing the original impact of the scene due to insufficient time given to settle down. It might have been better to swiftly attain the resolution to that situation since he is the protagonist, however how it was all resolved always felt to me in some facets unsatisfyingly fast and effortless. At the same time, it may have been the writer's intention to downplay this moment for future setups. If the main plot was intermingled with the Disney entity more often, with a more frequent trail of the main story, and further refinements in certain areas, such as Disney characters amounting to more than they were, I would have happily stated this was a masterful crossover rather than just a fairly crafted and engaging one, which isn't as unpleasant as it sounds, because again, this isn't the center of attention, however can detract from it. There are other examples of lethargic pacing, but I think a lot of us could excuse these weaknesses because of the trade-off of playing alongside your favorite Disney partners and voyaging through different evocative worlds was at the end of the day a special experience. This was of course the exact aspect that interested me and so many others. The original story was a major congenial addition and subversion of expectation, though it did lack a little focus. It was in fact a story that became far greater than what originally was intended to be, as we can deduce from interviews. In regards to the characters, there weren't too many pivotal figures, but there were just enough, since the focus was on the original characters. I especially enjoyed the profoundly mysterious nature of Mickey, though I do wish we could have seen more of a story footprint of his affairs. It was explained later down the line, however I think it would have helped his transition into the story better. The main boys, Donald and Goofy, I grew surprisingly fond of because of how they were introduced to Sora and how each grew in the end, but they uncaringly just wanted to use each other to strive towards their goals. I relished the dynamic between the three, all pertaining individual personalities, in that bouncing off one another leads to arguments, confusions, or moments of harmony. To see Donald and Goofy's development in their loyalty of their longtime friend, Mickey, sacrifice for a person they've only come to shortly know, but cherish despite so, in theory is a fascinating concept, delving into the confliction of duty into a firm sense of perseverance in what they believed in. They could have gone the one-dimensional route of becoming best friends immediately, with perfect relationships because they were simply Disney characters with comedic flaws, but they chose to explore the true nature of the fluctuation of friendship. Yet the delivery makes Donald and Goofy seem irrationally insensitive. The problem here to me is that Riku is clearly the enemy in this situation, and Donald, Goofy and Sora's relationship was already firmly established by this point. However, overall, the Disney and Square crossover worked out for the best, presenting a memorable setting and a sense of an ambitious adventure filled with iconic characters at its core, despite its missteps at times, ultimately reinforcing the center of the game's theme of expanding your horizons, connections, and remaining loyal to it. When it comes to the presentation, the art direction visually exhibits a stylistic graphical aesthetic that gives off a look in the vicinity of a cel-shaded game, a cartoon, and a touch of realism from Final Fantasy. The uncanny blend for the most part worked prosperously, displaying a prime example of Squaresoft's strengths in graphical fidelity and animation, both during game and within CGI cutscenes. Regardless of the fact that this is a demanding breed of multiple crossovers from all over the place, everything, as unbelievable as it may sound, looks strangely organic and appropriate. It's hard to imagine Donald Duck, Goofy and Cloud Strife in the same scene, but they somehow pulled it off. The Disney properties are recaptured accurately into this game, where Sora and the original cast are seamlessly adapted into each environment, with special attention given to Halloween Town and Atlantica. Heartless designs are marvelous in variety, purpose, and illusory aesthetic, filled with memorable monsters. The setting is awesome too, and the original worlds were a highlight to simply navigate through, in terms of visuals such as Hollow Bastion. The designer of the environments did an incredible job. Because of this, the presentation stayed the same consistently 10 years later, truly standing the test of time. There were, however, shortcomings in other areas, such as the often stiff facial animation that was and still is terribly distracting, in contrast to the more fluid animations that the developers were very capable of doing. There were other smaller details such as awkward and at times overblown dialogue, loosely edited cutscenes that leave too much silence for the conversation to feel natural, emptiness in some areas with absence of NPCs and etc. Although that last one, while has been a few boisterous source of a few complaints, can conveniently be explained by the present destruction of the world, consuming inhabitants of the population, enhancing the tone the game was going with. However, as we know later, this is just a management of resources or hardware limitations of the PS2. But for its time it was effective enough, and nevertheless still carries through its core message, even heightening it in some cases, most notably in pivotal moments of highlight, completely eliminating the vast majority of my complaints. I would like to also mention I was pleasantly surprised with the talented voice cast with outstanding performances, such as Haley Joel Osment as Sora, Billy Zane as Ansem, James Wood as Hades, Catherine Beaumont as Alice, the same actor in fact as the original way back in 1951, and many more. A fine display of devotion to the source material. The soundtrack in this game, composed by Yoko Shimomura, who previously worked on Parasite Eve, Super Mario RPG, and Legend of Mana, is outstanding to say the least. She was initially reluctant to take on such a task, understandably so, as it was a foreign concept of mixing the RPG elements of Squaresoft and Disney collectively. The pressure would have been very high. The direction given to her was vague, and she couldn't grasp where to even begin with her compositions. She even recalled to herself having absolutely no idea what kind of a game this was. However, it was through long sessions of trial and error and actually playing the game herself that she could illustrate her own interpretation of what complemented and set the areas, combat, characters, and cutscene. Overcoming and working around the PlayStation 2 hardware limits was another addition to the adversities she had to face, but in the end we received an extraordinary score filled with vigorous life that matched the setting excellently because of her own efforts to understand the game. There's an extensive library of joyous to dark, Disney-inspired to the mostly original arrangements, a perfect balance of familiarity and new experiences, where Shimomura still retains her identifiable style and the tone of Kingdom Hearts. The Gummi ship's theme, for example, is an astonishing example of just how well the music fits with the storyline, as there are 3 renditions that transforms from a playful atmosphere of a new adventure to far more of a firm sense of duty, focus and intensity towards endgame territory. Another example of this is the opening of Dearly Beloved and the reprised rendition, beginning as a warm introduction to the fantastic story and ending as a soft music box, articulating reflection of a concluded tale. And let's not forget Utada Hikaru's opening and ending theme, simple and clean, as well as Kaoru Wada's orchestral arrangement. There are, in my opinion, magnificent character and battle tracks found in later installments that surpasses this game in its grand, thrilling and emotional value. But this was the beginning of it all. My favourites were Fragments of Sorrow, a dramatic piece of imperativeness, Hikari, a beautiful orchestral of the grandeur adventure that is Kingdom Hearts, and of course Dearly Beloved, a peaceful, divine yet a simple score that sets the players off on the beginning of every journey that I would turn my PS2 on just to hear. The only criticism I have is that there can be awkward silence at times in cutscenes, and that there are a few mediocre themes that don't fit the greatest, but that is a lot to ask for, and I'm sure I've made it clear just how much I love the overall soundtrack of Kingdom Hearts. I certainly know I'm not alone on this, with multiple orchestral events and albums released over the years. The combat system is fine for what it is, but does suffer from a few issues, being the first one in the series. Coming back to it recently, it feels dated and hasn't aged the best, as this was the beginnings of Kingdom Hearts, as well as early into the lifespan of the PS2. The search for a lasting identity hadn't fully been realized at this point, representing the skeleton or blueprint of the series. At the game's base, it is an action hack-and-slash RPG with references of Final Fantasy, elements of exploration, platforming, and a 3D rail shooter minigame. Kingdom Hearts 2 is the peak of the franchise mechanically speaking in my opinion, with exceptional dynamic attacks, heaviness, variety, and an utter joy of momentum and movement. Kingdom Hearts 1 is far slower, but doesn't inherently make it an inferior product just from that premise. That being said, there were quite a few qualities I enjoyed more in this particular game over others, especially in the final mix version where they introduced an expanded collection of new abilities. The beginning Destiny Island segment of the game is both story and gameplay wise quite monotonously slow and boring, with mundane fetch quests that are severely lacking in any direction, as the materials needed blend excruciatingly well with the background. Even now I forget where exactly I'm meant to go at times, and the process isn't stimulating in the slightest. This is even more of a hindrance when considering the wide target audience, as I remember spending hours stuck on this island as a kid. But again, it has its crucial role in defining the main cast and setting the serene, hopeful paradise archetype, and thankfully doesn't last extensively. Only after you acquire party members beyond Traverse Town, the battle system opens up with the attainment of dodge roll, magic, and so on, which I think is far too slow of a progression, and can be said for the rest of the game. I understand everything should play fine, and you shouldn't encounter any major predicaments, but it just feels too restrictive given its length, and feels clumsy to dodge with the jump button. However, when it finally alleviates this fixation and finally loosens up, I think it can be good. The basic attacks are solid and sharp, with a fair range of flashy, heavy-hitting abilities such as Sonic Blade, a technique that allows its user to perform an array of thrusting attacks, Stun Impact, a combo finisher inflicting stun, Ars Arcanum, a widely fast combo of attacks, and etc. Customizing my abilities of assault moves such as limits and protective enhancements are a nice way of varying and catering towards more aggressive or passive styles of play, and sewing light strategy into the mix. I've always appreciated the solidity and gravity in the animations, on top of the physics behind each move, even if it can feel annoyingly slow and stiff to control. Movement can feel a little touchy and clunky at times, contributing to the deficiency of flow. This can be cumbersome to handle, and the fact it is slow seriously emboldens the aggravation of no swing cancellation, which isn't automatically bad, but is a problem when you have many reasonably fast enemies on and off screen, that can make things unpredictable on top of camera controls. Potions are eminently stagnant on top of this. Where this is completely fine is usually in one-on-one combat, where mastery of timing and discipline of each swing feels rewarding. You also have your defensive or offensive magic-based abilities, such as casting Blizzard, Fire, Cure, Arrow, and etc., all consuming MP. Summons can also be unlocked over time, where you call upon iconic Disney characters during combat to aid Sora in a variety of ways that can feel gimmicky for some players, but proves to be greatly useful. There's also the inclusion of tech points, an exclusive of the series. I legitimately forgot this was a feature, where the game rewards its players with points of experience whenever they successfully reflect, parry, or exploit a special move the enemy is naturally weak to. The system gives excellent incentive to take such risks. I've always felt for me personally that dodging achieves almost the same objective as the other two, but is safer in most cases, so introducing the tech system is a great way to challenge myself. Finally understanding the advantages and bearings of the offensive follow-up uses you could potentially pull off. A lot of the satisfaction from this game comes from the reading of each situation, developing the player's sense of timing and pulling off a parry. In doing so, the game rewards you, which I think is awesome. The game itself is thoroughly balanced, with instruments of combat viable in most scenarios, coupled with little to no grinding. The right idea for any action RPG. The developers could have very well made this into a grindfest of a game, as it is inspired by long-lit traditional turn-based RPGs. The outcome produces a rather realistic sensation of your average human boy receiving a magical weapon for the first time, where the Keyblade almost behaves like a wand, bestowing incredible powers, while still being wielded by a normal person. Battles can truly feel like genuine duels that shines when compared to the other entries, but in conjunction to my last complaint, the tools you end up acquiring for fighting comes in small numbers of simply limits, magic, and summons, quite the bare bones for the franchise, causing the already basic combat to constantly fall back on your standard repetitive attacks, mindlessly hacking your way through your enemies. There are certainly more noteworthy and optimal ways to dive through the game from watching brilliant speedrunners, but for the casual or average audience, you can get away with lazily mashing the X button for a considerable portion of the experience. The game doesn't go out of its way to flaunt the benefits of diversifying your moveset, and the need to do so isn't incentivized enough. I do value the attempts to change between magic and physical attacks against certain enemies. but it either results to feeling dull to the easily recognizable pattern, they can come far and few in between, or can get old expeditiously since the options you have are limiting in the first place. The sense of progression and growth in my playtime of the game is trifling for its length. This is slightly diminutive and disappointing, going extensive intervals of time without unlocking many new abilities to break up the staleness. I think if this game had light and heavy attacks similar to other ARPGs and fighting games, added extra combo variety, eased the accessibility of stacking multiple techniques into your combos like in KH2, pushed for a more varied experience in showcasing all your tools, or increased the pacing of unlocking certain abilities, this fault would have mostly been eradicated, something that is amended in later titles. Doing this would have decreased the insipid and tediousness of the game, something Square seem to have understood. This is why I recommend Proud Mode, as you will need to experiment a little bit more. Outside of my problems with repetition, the camera is another area of inadvertence. If you played the original PlayStation 2, the only method of controlling it was the R2 and L2 button. Evidence of the developers' rough experimentation, since it was still so early into the production of 3D action RPGs. In the end, this control scheme proved to be archaic and disregarding of the superior option of the right joystick. However, in the 1.5 remix or final mix version, this was updated, but nevertheless continues to remain appalling. Each room in Kingdom Hearts is more often than not claustrophobic and small, giving further projection to the short-sightedness that is the unreasonably close proximity of the camera to Sora, controlling weirdly a lot of the times. Getting used to maneuvering it can be taxing on patience for the newcomers and feels awkward. Locking on is also exasperating and troubling, as it will often select objects and not enemies. In future installments, this is almost completely eliminated, as the angle is higher and the distance is increased, positioned in a way that allows greater view of the battlefield, and for the environments and enemies not to block the perception of its players, unlike in Kingdom Hearts 1. The expansion of rooms also improved this. Party members are welcome additions, where Donald and Goofy will join the fray, and depending on the current Disney films players are currently passaging through, they will also have access to the protagonist of that movie, to replace either of the two party members such as Jack Skellington, Tarzan, Ariel, Aladdin, and more. While there are literal memes and tears shed for Donald's perpetual state of death and not healing during combat, party members are fortuitously minor in their role, predominantly behaving as a possible healer for Sora. Depending on the AI that can be unreliable at times, but does its job for the most part even if it seems rather plain. But they do influence the gameplay enough to feel bare on your own. I generally ignore them in the midst of gameplay. There isn't ample more to say, other than a commendable extra mile the developers went through to incorporate Disney characters as party members, like in any old school RPG. When it comes to boss fights and the enemies themselves, it can be a hit and miss. There's definitely a lot of variation in enemies and how you approach each one. Some will be difficult, testing your reflexes, utility use, timing, reading, and knowledge. Whereas there will be other times of simplicity of just thoughtlessly attacking. I don't think the game proportions these two aspects well, with the latter prevailing in volume by far. The dominant offenders are Jafar and the Behemoth, designed incredibly bland, flat, and straight up boring. Both pose little to no threat, with Jafar's only method of damage is throwing sluggish lava boulders or the occasional smack that are easily dodgeable and readable. The primary method of fighting is chasing Iago the entire time, through the already annoying platforming. The Behemoth is slightly less of a hindrance, but all you have to do is climb on his back and mash X to win. There are so many others, both boss and filler enemies, that resembles these in their repetitive design, and my patience was truly tested. In addition to all the other problems with the controls I mentioned before. However, amidst of all the flawed adversities lies the saving grace of combat, where bosses like Riku and Sephiroth puts attention to what made the battles of KH1 special, the feeling that you were in a proper duel. Both of these fights are fair and challenging. Each forces its players to use considerably more than just one tool. Take a moment to study the attack pattern, develop a strategy and a precise sense of timing, showing full display of just how deep the skill level can go despite its simpleness. And none of these tests of skills are unfair in any way for the sake of just being hard. Where a myriad of strategies can be taken to obtain victory, each strike from the boss is forewarned strictly but not cheaply, and discipline is needed to prevail, just like in a real sword fight. Discovering my most optimal way of fighting and achieving it, in the end was immensely accomplishing. Between worlds you have your Gummi ship segments that I once upon a time loved. There are wild and creative experiments to be done on the vehicle. That is the best thing about this minigame. Other than that, it plays like a bad Star Fox game. It is terribly slow in pacing and has no sense of danger. I recognize the relaxing appeal, but it lasts far too long for my taste at a frequent basis, and I prefer the game without these sections. Not having the warp function from the start was a pain. The less time in these Gummi ships the better, that's just my opinion. Towards the end it did get faster, so it's okay for what it's worth. Platforming and exploration do play a moderate role outside of the core battle system. While I can praise the openness and freedom that is proposed to its players to promote the liberty in the story, controlling Sora can feel extremely stiff and clumsy. He definitely wasn't designed for platforming. Square evidently aimed to create something akin to their inspiration for the project, Super Mario 64, but awkwardly failed to capture the dynamic, flexible and thrilling movement. It does, however, at least remain consistent in spite of its drawbacks, so players can master it by the end of the game, even if the process is subpar. The levels are structured in a non-linear fashion, invoking largeness even if it's far smaller in reality, along with plenty of backtracking. Kingdom Hearts executes this in a fair range of ways, bouncing between different sizes, verticality, objectives and minigames to discern separate identities to each world, regularly changing the flow, which is a positive. Deep Jungle had tree swinging and jungle sliding, Agrabah had a magic carpet sequence, Wonderland had you continuously changing your size and walking up walls, Colosseum has you fight in your typical tournament or arena RPG setting, and etc. However, Atlantica was painful when it came to movement, easily my least favourite world. The environments in certain areas of the game is also interactive, but can get in the way of the combat, as it is quite easy to interact accidentally, by climbing on a tree for example when fighting. All of these minor, short distractions frankly didn't need to be included, but reflects on the extra mile the developers went through to contrive the distinctiveness for each film. I above all adore the union between the game design and story in Hollow Bastion, where you straight up play as a heartless version of Sora. The major criticism shared by numerous players is the scarcity of direction in where to go and what to do. Although I deem this is a little overblown, since the maps are usually small, short length and encourages exploration, I will confess Atlantica and Monstera is potentially hampering to navigate through, since the environments look all too similar, as well as the weird design choices. Kingdom Hearts is an ambitious game that manages to serve a ravishing, emotional and piquant storyline of adolescence and camaraderie, even if the delivery, lore and lead-up can be unrefined, abruptly set up or outlandish, with exceptions to the climatic scenes. It is a raw tale, and at the center of it all, liberates a narrative comprising a well-realized heart and character. The worlds visited are vibrant, defiant and somewhat memorable, all contributing a piece to the payoff and character development, albeit can impede the overarching story, feel a little empty and bestow little importance in the grand scheme of things, feeling at times uninteresting. Combat is praiseworthy as the first of the series, with solid, satisfying, balanced mechanics, and the occasional splendid boss fights, offering the base for the franchise to stand and evolve from, in addition to many minigames and objectives outside of the main gameplay that appreciatively kept the flow upbeat, but is naturally outdated and clunky for today's standards when it comes down to repetitive controls, navigating and certain enemy designs. The art direction is colourfully stylistic, deriving a timeless look that allowed several crossovers combining, perfecting the translation in the balance between the source material and the game itself. However, facial animation and cutscene pacing is often quite rough. Finally, the soundtrack is excellent. Kingdom Hearts is an experience of passion and novelty, among my most beloved childhood games of all time, even if playing it today can feel dated, but is recommended for those who are getting into the series, as this is a vital setup piece. There's something for everyone to love, and for that, I give it a 3.7 out of 5. Thank you all for watching my Kingdom Hearts retrospective critique. If you enjoyed, please consider leaving a like, comment and subscribe. I hope I did this game justice for a franchise I grew up with. Look forward to future video improvements, as this was my very first of doing a retrospective, so please be gentle in the comments. And also expect more critiques heading into the release of Kingdom Hearts 3. However, this series of videos will continue beyond the upcoming game. I cannot sustain that amount of work in the time I have, and I prefer to take my time in creating something that will last. I'd like to give special thanks to Everglow, who does incredibly crafted timeline videos for the community, and WillJV2, who does a lot of boss challenges for Kingdom Hearts, for allowing me to use some gameplay footage for endgame territory, as I was short on time. I'd like to also mention Dark Pixel Gaming for their own retrospective videos that have heavily inspired me to make my own. I'm super thankful to have come across them. They talk a lot about Final Fantasy and other JRPGs, which are far better videos than I could ever hope to achieve. These channels are really special and deserves your time. Anyways, again, thank you all for your support. I hope this is worth the watch. Until next time, I will see you later.